sustainable groundwater resources development and management, the plan have to be described and made known. As more pressure is exerted on this precious water resource, potentials for conflict mitigation, and the mitigation strategies need to be instituted at the same time. When you identify this potential for conflict, then we need to come up with the conflict mitigation mechanisms. This is the case in point in South Sudan, where we've had conflicts arising and is still continuing over lack of access to water, especially at certain periods of the year. We know that South Sudan is endowed with vast reserves of water resources, and especially that water is available during the wet season, and unfortunately it becomes unavailable during the dry season. As such, most of our communities, especially the cattle rearing communities, migrate from one area to the other in search of grazing areas as well as in search of water. Part of these communities, even as we know, within the IGAD region, cross into the Turkana in Kenya. Some of them cross into Uganda, the Karamojong zone, and the vice versa. At the same time, it precipitates conflict. The facilitator here had spoken about the issue of conflicts also within the region that IGAD is a conflict-prone region. We need to look at this issue as one driver possibly which can exacerbate conflict. And therefore, because of these conflicts, most of these conflicts are armed conflicts, and therefore proliferation of arms into the hands of communities is widespread, and given that, the possibility of large-scale conflicts is likely to be there. We commend the government of Uganda that has made great efforts in disarming part of their communities. This has also resulted in relative peace and stability in the Republic of South Sudan, as our communities no longer find incentives to come and attack their neighbors in the Karamojong region. Therefore, having said this, since we are aware that part of the IGAD region is water scarce and part of it has access to water, what are we possibly going to plan within the region in order to ensure that we share our common water resources for the common good of the people of our country? I do not want to state that it is obvious conflicts have been happening due to lack of water. This is a fact which is known. And as our population expands, the resource, as I mentioned at the beginning, will become scarce, and therefore competition and conflict over the resource will come on board. But I think as we look forward, we have a monumental responsibility as sons and daughters of this country, of this region, not to plan about what we want to do today in order to minimize this conflict by extracting the existing groundwater. But let us strategically think and plan together and come up with the right policies and strategies to ensure that we enrich these groundwater reserves, not for our current generation, but for the use of generations to come in the future. As it is said, the next conflict will be over water, but do we want to leave our generation to come to start that fight? Or we would like to have and come up with the strategies to ensure that our generations to come will be water secure for some time to come. Having said that, we would like us within the region, we know that some of us are well advanced in terms of policies, strategies, and the capacities, and others are not. Let us work together consistently to develop each other's capacities and bring us and build us so that we together stand strong. There are instances which we have seen in the region where flash waters have become a source of misery to our communities. whole buses, whole trucks, and goods have been washed away because of these flood waters. Then thereafter, during dry season, this water is not available, leaving our communities to scramble over what, if it had been stored for them, could have been made useful. Therefore, I am not going to repeat myself. Let us really build and come up with the strategies in order to. But above that, do we have the structures in place in order to monitor and observe the behavior of groundwater in terms of quantity, quality, and distribution within the region? Time and again, most of the water supply infrastructure created in rural communities, especially to assist our cattle rearing communities and some farmers, are designed and planned without the participation of the whole group. Women are excluded in the planning process. The youth sometimes are excluded because their chiefs are there. And in the end of the day, when it comes to the real use and utilization of this resource, you find that conflict arises because certain sections and segments of the community cannot access the water facility, be it groundwater or surface water. The other aspect is that over-exploitation of this resource can create damage to the groundwater aquifer. Therefore, then, without taking much of your time, let me stop here and hear from some other panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Engineer. What a better person to address these issues of disparities in terms of water supply and sanitation within the region. Fortunately, we have Dr. Jenny Grodwell now on. I would like to invite her. She was introduced a little earlier. Jenny, we have known your biodata, and so if I could just straight away invite you to address us, give us the keynote address. Jenny, please. Jenny, please.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I hope there were no unfortunate delays anywhere. Here I am, and here you are. Very happy to be with you. So, dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for inviting me to give this keynote on groundwater for peace and stability. I'm not with you in beautiful Uganda. I have such fond memories from the Aquifer conference 2 years back. But I join you from Stockholm on behalf of CB's International Center for Water Cooperation. The center contributes to context-specific solutions for cooperation over shared freshwater resources and is hosted by CB under the auspices of UNESCO as Category 2 Center. And I'm going to share my screen now. There we go. And I should be in presentation mode now, I hope. Am I in presentation mode? Can someone please tell me? I don't seem to be able to.
Yes.
Yes, very good. Thank you so much. Then I will continue. So in this presentation today, I will be starting by setting water scarcity and security in context of conflict, and then give some examples of how groundwater resources and cooperation, if managed right, provide us with opportunities for stable and peaceful societies. And I hope that I'm now going to the next slide. It looks very strange on my computer here, and I'm not really sure why I can't. Why is it looking so strange? This is really I'm so sorry about this. Okay, seems we have a problem here. I'm really, really sorry. Meeting controls. not sure why this is not working now. I can't seem to show been able to show my next slide. In presentation mode.
Jenny, you're not in presentation mode.
I'm not. Thank you. I don't know why. It says on my screen that I am sharing my screen, but I can't go to presentation mode. There's something that's really strange here. I'm going to stop sharing again. Thanks, Adrian. Let's try. Everything seems to be frozen here. Really very sorry about this. I'm going to try and restart my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, let's give it another try. Okay. I still can't hear, finally. Okay. So I'm with you. Sorry for that delay. That's why you should always have a green room there where you can prepare these things in advance. Anyway, first of all, in my presentation, I'd like to debunk that common myth, at least one of them making media headlines. Does water provide reasons for war, or is it a unifier? Well, let's be clear. Countries don't go to war over water. Experts said this already 20 years ago. No formal wars have been declared centered around this resource, as found by Aaron Wolf and others. Rather, the most common measures of water stress should not be considered indicators of future conflicts. Water indeed acts as a unifier because water is a resource so basic that the countries negotiate over it sooner than they actually fight. Nonetheless, public unrest, even serious political instability, can result from the lack of clean fresh water, which occasionally spirals into violent conflict. These findings were picked up in a project commissioned by the UNESCO IHP, the From Potential Conflict to Cooperation Potential project, in 2003, which promoted, among other things, river basin organizations as a means to ensure that conflicts were resolved at the negotiation and consultation level rather than being elevated all the way to adjudication or arbitration outside the courtroom. Today, we are more aware that not all aquifers are linked hydrologically to surface water bodies and watersheds, though. In the almost 2 decades that have passed since, plenty of data have been gathered and analyzed on the likelihood of water disputes and the potential hotspots for such disputes around the world. Here, from European Union research that showed how scarcity of water, high population density, power imbalances, and climatic stresses are the main factors which push countries towards either political cooperation or tensions in transboundary river basins. We can see here that the Nile Basin is marked as having a high likelihood of issues emerging. In 2017, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation said that in many places of the world, tensions and conflicts over water are becoming more frequent. Water scarcity is growing and leading to political and social unrest, and while the techniques governments have used in responding to past disturbances may no longer be appropriate, the response, the pursuit of peace, must be an undramatic, everyday process. This map, which is part of the report, shows physical water risks based on World Wildlife Fund water risk assessment overlaid by the economic water scarcity based on the World Resources Institute's Aqueduct global maps and fragile countries as defined by the OECD. And in this snippet here, the location of some global water stress hotspots in the Horn of Africa are clearly visible, involving Ethiopia, Sudan, and Kenya. Another attempt at collating data on water and conflict was initiated by the Pacific Institute in the late 1980s. This database categorizes events and presents the information in a map with data points. Information comes, for instance, from the Human Rights Watch, documenting the extraction of water wells and other water supply sources, and other organizations and media outlets reporting things such as police using ammunition against demonstrators protesting water shortages. Though the map and the list have not been updated since October 2019, this database provides good examples of tensions and who are involved and over what. The Global Early Warning Tool is a more recent and updated every quarter. It lists current conflict and drought conditions based on the machine learning methodology to forecast conflicts over the next 12 months. It considers environmental data alongside socioeconomical variables, and in a combination that was lacking in previous tools designated to predict water conflicts. This tool looks at over 80 indicators going back up to 20 years, and the tool is then able to use what it has learned about the correlation among these variables to predict conflict or no conflict given current conditions. And the aim is to help actors identify conflict hotspots before violence erupts. So here I can download data on, for instance, city zone in Somali region, Ethiopia, which I'm currently researching. I can then add the layers showing lower than average precipitation, areas that are severely or moderately dry. As we can see, only minor parts of Ethiopia are highlighted as dry, whereas the situation looks grimmer in parts of Sudan and South Sudan for the past 24 months. There is now also a new database called the East Africa Drought Watch, the first transboundary system that uses near real-time Earth observation and weather information to monitor drought conditions in this region. Together, databases such as this and the previously shown ones can assist us in our understanding of where water scarcity can act as a driver of public unrest and conflict, and thereby prepare the world community for the need to mitigate water stress and potential threats to stability. They can tell us what factors can be influenced and which ones are becoming more common as a result of increasing demand, competition over water, and as linked to climate change. However, it needs to be pointed out that the databases cannot give a very granular data, and also that many critical aspects will be dependent on local socioeconomic context and responses. And it must be stressed that public unrest can erupt also due to poor water quality, such as when the water distributed to residents has not undergone proper treatment, or when water bodies are polluted due to neglect and government mismanagement. In addition, research on water scarcity and conflict has largely neglected groundwater resources, or tends to bundle this resource with surface water. This year, 2022, is all about both this underground water resource and its host reservoirs, the aquifers, and about making the invisible visible. The challenge is not only with regards to where the groundwater is and how much can sustainably be abstracted. It's also about raising awareness around natural and human-made contamination of the water underground, and how hardware and technical infrastructure, but also nature-based solutions matter. Furthermore, in considering groundwater for peace and stability, we must account for traditional knowledge as well as tomorrow's needs. As we know, in contrast to rivers and lakes, a major challenge is, of course, the hidden character of groundwater and the still somewhat limited knowledge we have about it. So in an era when the want for water for different purposes is ever-growing and surface water availability is decreasing and variability and uncertainty also increases, groundwater is often the resource left, and aquifers have the advantage of acting as buffers. In this respect, groundwater can serve as the strategic backup of offering resilience, and thereby this resource can also promote the building of water security and stability if used strategically. One aspect of this is the understanding of and acting upon that aquifers and aquifer systems in many cases stretch rather far below our feet and traverse the human-made borders that we have drawn between countries and subnational states. 468 transboundary aquifers and groundwater bodies have been identified worldwide to date, and hence the vast majority of all countries share groundwater resources with each other. We may adhere to administrative and political boundaries with passports and COVID travel restrictions ruling how we can move, but water doesn't. As UNESCO, IHP, and IGAD have put it in their 2021 brochure on transboundary aquifers of the world, transboundary aquifers are aquifers which cross national borders. Perhaps we should reverse it and call boundaries trans-aquifers. After all, aquifers were there first. Now, outside our bubble, groundwater may not be the first water source that comes to mind when thinking about water conflict and peace. But history contains many examples of conflicts involving, for instance, the poisoning of groundwater, and one can all too easily picture rotting animal corpses thrown into wells to deny enemies access to potable water. And groundwater is at risk also as a part of modern warfare. Amnesty, for instance, has reported about sabotage of irrigation wells that aims to hinder future farming and thereby threaten food security in the areas targeted. And drinking water's infrastructure may have been destroyed during the ongoing civil war in Ethiopia as well. Warfare against or by means of water is utterly incompatible with the principles and rules of humanitarian law. These are universally recognized rules, many of which are considered customary international law. Accordingly, water or drinking water installations and supplies and irrigation works is a civilian object, indispensable to survival of the population. It is forbidden to employ poison or poisoned weapons against such objects. But conflicts over water do not always involve countries. Local, small-scale, inter-community tensions also play out in the face of competition for scarce resources, or where there is perception of future scarcity risks to come. They can also take place across trans-regional, subnational borders, or, for instance, between farmers and city dwellers, and between governments and people who see that they are not being served with water for their daily needs. Here, a recent photo story in British The Guardian shows how a local groundwater conflict can look. We see children and women collecting water from dug wells and are told that men must guard those water points from other villages because of clashes over the available water. And let's remember here that in Kenya, like in many other African countries, pastoralists' way of life involves crossing political boundaries in search of resources such as water and pasture. And this has prompted IGAD to actively support cooperation and development of such borderlands through the establishment of different clusters as a novel institutional framework to enable harmonization, regulation, and promotion of cross-border interventions, including capacity building, peace dialogues, and multi-stakeholder fora. And as stressed in this PowerPoint slide by IGAD's Dr. Dominic Kathia, pastoralists often migrate in search of resources. As an example of the work conducted, this particular cross-border area, the Karamoja cluster, is shared between 4 countries, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Sudan, and Uganda, and occupied by at least 13 pastoralist and agro-pastoralist communities. In IGAD's development facilitation work, this is considered as one ecological zone, best perceived within the framework of one consolidated development plan. It is acknowledged that there is a need for one institutional arrangement to facilitate cross-border cooperation. Another example of collaboration and networking points to how the participation of women in negotiation processes leads to agreements and treaties that last longer. This peace process case studies from the Central America region, which is interconnected through 23 international watercourses and 18 transboundary aquifers. As elsewhere, the joint management of these water resources often requires a difficult balance of different interests and uses. The active participation of women in water diplomacy is therefore critical to ensure that sustainable management of shared water resources, peace and stability. On the African continent, the Women in Water Diplomacy Network in the Nile is a successful program working to connect women for sharing of institutional and other knowledge and offer support around the challenges and opportunities of gendering water diplomacy. What about the state in all this? One groundwater-focused conflict study found that lacking access to groundwater is associated with a higher risk of communal violence, and the effect of groundwater access on communal violence is conditioned by precipitation levels as well as population density. But in this map, in which the author has looked at groundwater availability, we see that violence is more common where the depth to the water table is large. This is marked in red color in this map. And we can see that many conflict zones involve political border areas, so transboundary aquifers. But the study found that the effect of groundwater on violence is smaller in areas with higher state presence. And in a follow-up study, the author found that a state's ability to mitigate the human security consequences of resource shortages can lessen the effects of constrained access to groundwater on communal violence. Further to this, in a study on management of groundwater scarcity hotspots, the authors point to groundwater being the only viable resource in most arid and semi-arid environments that can sustain rural and urban populations. Where monitoring is inadequate and there's a lack of understanding of the local groundwater conditions, coupled with poor governance, the risk of supply failure as well as the possibility of conflict increases. We see in the figure how over time the competition for groundwater can even lead to an anarchic society and unsustainable groundwater resource potential. Now, it's worth recalling that international cooperation is not a zero-sum game. Most authors also consider conflict and cooperation as two opposite sides of a spectrum or continuum. Transboundary water interactions are not static, but rather in constant flux, influenced by and influencing the broader political context in which they occur. According to this transboundary water interaction nexus or twins model, transboundary water relations can encompass 4 levels of conflict intensity. The ideal state would be here, where I placed a little sun, and that's where joint actions and shared goals are acknowledged, and costs and risks that follow from doing so are assumed. This applies also to transboundary aquifers. So the solution to conflict over groundwater may look simple, as in this UN water infographic from the MDG era, where elements of water scarcity are shown. So here we have peace and stability, which is today captured in SDG 16, and we have transboundary cooperation that we find in SDG 6.5 and 6a, and governance is of course another cornerstone. But when the International Association of Hydrogeologists, IAH, reflected on this topic of water security and groundwater last year, they stressed 2 aspects of interest, namely that there is need to much improve the levels of field monitoring and data analysis for potentially conflicting situations. Such activities are well worth financing to obtain the anticipated benefits of averting water conflicts. I will come back to the need for data after a few words about cooperation, governance, institutions, and diplomacy. Back in 2005, a group of researchers stressed that transboundary groundwater and surface water systems tend to be managed under different regimes, resulting in what has been described as hydroschizophrenia. To illustrate, in 2018, another group of researchers counted more than 200 surface water-oriented treaties globally. And then there were 5 that were groundwater-oriented and 52 conjunctively oriented that mentioned both groundwater and surface water. But only 8 of those devote substantive focus to both groundwater and surface water. An antidote to such fragmentation to treat groundwater and surface water less in silos, whether there is or isn't an agreement between the aquifer states, and to manage resources conjunctively is, of course, through applying governance mechanisms and principles. As a concrete example of what it can entail, we can look at the example of collaboration across the Canadian-US border. Here, Forrest found that bilateral partnerships often evolved informally within grey areas of groundwater governance. And interlocal transboundary groundwater supply agreements were negotiated and implemented by lower level authorities as a matter of local scale diplomacy, involving public institutions representing the interests of their respective local populations. And these were subsequently recognized by upper levels of governments. So diplomacy can matter also at the local scale. But we often think about diplomacy as a so-called multi-track process that depends on there being international law and established institutions, political will and commitments, policy frameworks, and preferably shared norms and values that are products of joint efforts, trust building, and the leveraging of expertise that can in turn become dialogue entry points for stable agreements. In terms of institutions, the UNECE and its Water Convention play important roles. Representatives of countries that have ratified, countries that have ratified or accessed to the convention meet every 2 years. In 2020, a vision for transboundary cooperation around the Senegal-Mauritanian Aquifer Basin, SMAB, was developed by representatives of the 4 concerned West African countries. This vision seeks to promote peace and resilience and conjunctive use of the river basin's surface water and groundwater. And in 2021, there was a special session on water at the Conference of the Parties of the UNECE Water Convention, much like this section we're sitting in right now, aiming to foster peace. This was cause for celebration because of the signature of a declaration between the aquifer states to set up a permanent mechanism for concerted management of the SMAB. Another good example of cooperation on transboundary aquifers from the African continent is the Northwestern Sahara aquifer system. The transboundary cooperation on this is described partially in terms of its peace and security benefits. According to this report, those benefits entail positive basin identity, sense of common ownership, mutual trust, reduced potential sources of conflict and increased stability, and viable basis for broader political cooperation beyond water management. Worth mentioning is how the national water and planning authorities benefit from enhanced availability of information and planning capacity. Which brings us back to that no substantial collaboration is viable without data, information, and knowledge, and the exchange of such between the concerned aquifer states, management bodies, and the world community. And here I again want to highlight the study on assessment of aquifers along the Mexico-US border, and how these assessments involve collaboration to obtain the data. They improve the information base. The assessments serve to situate groundwater within the water, food, energy, climate, ecosystem nexus, and they underpin the larger arena of international law, policy, and management. Importantly, effective monitoring and management are highly dependent on social, institutional, and political factors. For a TBA agreement to succeed, due attention must always be paid to the social and political impact on either side of the affected border, according to findings in this study. I have spoken about international law and agreements, transboundary aquifers, the need for data and information, for peace based on groundwater sharing. I have stressed that countries do not go to war over water, but that public unrest and even conflict can result from water scarcity at different levels and scales. But let me be clear, greater stability and true development can only be achieved if governments and other bodies acknowledge that groundwater is a very local resource. Wells and pumping devices can be owned by individual households or villages, meaning that decisions are made at this very local level and often without the bigger picture, without knowledge about the water cycle or how, for instance, aquifer recharge and sustainable use are impacted by climate change. Indeed, as Susanne Schmeier at the IGAD Delft says, violence occurs between non-state actors or representatives of certain sectors at the local level. Such local conflicts are much more difficult to control and tend to escalate rapidly, which is a main difference from the transboundary level where relations between states often limit this escalation of water-related conflicts. So aquifer systems serve millions of households who arrange their own water access in rural as well as urban and peri-urban areas. For this group and the self-supply, which still largely goes under the radar, we must appreciate and support how people find coping mechanisms and seek to avoid water stress by themselves accessing groundwater for different purposes. To mitigate risks of public unrest and build stability, awareness must be raised about how to manage groundwater and ensure it is protected from contamination. In other words, take proactive measures based on how people use groundwater, bringing actors together and enabling them to take action at an early stage. To wrap up, groundwater and aquifers cross borders of nations, regions, and river basins. Databases, I've shown you some today, can assist our understanding of where water scarcity can act as a driver of public unrest and conflict. We cannot manage what we do not measure. Groundwater needs to be better mapped, analyzed, monitored, and its users need to be better understood. Good governance principles call for involvement of users on the ground, for instance, in participatory mapping exercises and decision-making. Hydro diplomacy involving groundwater resources can create possible dialogue entry points, provide information that can be essential for the management of shared water systems, and put a spotlight on the most vulnerable groups and their human security. Cooperation is key to avoid conflicts and is not a zero-sum game, but part of a continuum. And finally, peace and social stability is defined not only by the absence of conflict, but also by the absence of the perception of future scarcity and competition. And with that, I thank you so much.
Jenny, you could see how rich that paper was. Well researched, well investigated, examples from the continent, examples from Latin America. And so that's the kind of paper we expected from Jenny. And Jenny, we want to thank you very much. We apologize for the technical issues that has caused delay, but that was a very rich paper. Now, I still have panelists here who I would like to invite to comment on Jenny's paper, but also to bring some local pictures so that we have some photographic memories of issues that are around us. We have listened to Engineer Emmanuel, who spoke a little earlier. We still have Dr. Kalist Tindimugaya to come and comment on the keynote address and also raise specific issues. We have also Mr. Brighton Munyai, who is representing James Shariyomba, still to come. And I have my Somali representative here in the meeting also to comment about groundwater system. Let me give Kalist 5 minutes. Dr. Kalist.
Thank you very much, moderator. First of all, I would like to thank Jenny for the very, very comprehensive presentation. Very, very interesting, and I think the issue of discussion, groundwater for peace and stability, has been given adequate attention. I want to agree with Jenny that water acts as a unifier. There isn't anything you can do without water. Water for drinking, water for agriculture, water for livestock, water for industrial development, water for everything. So because water brings people together, because our livelihoods depend on water, because our socio-economic development depends on water, water unifies us. And we cannot do without water. So I really would want to thank Jenny for emphasizing that. And of course, in situations where we have conflicts or potential conflicts around water, because all of us need water, we cannot afford to go to war. And I'm happy that Jenny has indicated that we haven't had any wars around water. While there has always been a talk that the next world war will be on water, but I think history indicates that there hasn't been any war on water. Before any war happens, we have to come together. We need water. Without water, we cannot survive, so we cannot afford to go to war. So I think potential conflicts will, at the end of the day, lead to potential cooperation. So again, the keynote speech has highlighted that. So turning crisis into opportunities for peace building, I think, is something that is happening. And I think we have these cases within our region. For example, we have been having conflicts between Uganda and Kenya, the pastoralists. Moving from Kenya to Uganda, some from Uganda to Kenya, and they are fighting. But the moment you provide them water, then they settle down. In those regions, the dry areas, because we don't have much surface water, we have had to drill a number of boreholes. And you provide water, and then the people settle down. Where people are conflicting, and now they become friends. So again, turning crisis into opportunities for peace building is evident, and it's not something that we are not seeing currently. And of course, while all of this has been happening, and I think the keynote presentation was clear on that, we tend to take groundwater for granted. Many of the discussions don't consider groundwater. Again, groundwater is undercover, hidden, and often forgotten. So we need, again, building on this forum to bring groundwater high on the agenda. We pick it from underground and bring it to the surface, so that it can actually also be discussed in a different fora, because in many of our countries, and indeed, I think the keynote presentation earlier alluded to that, we are depending on groundwater, sometimes without even thinking about it. Some countries depending on it up to 90%. But oftentimes people take it for granted. So, but we need knowledge. And probably that has been the problem, and I think the keynote Jenny has highlighted that. We need scientific knowledge on this resource. You can't manage what you don't understand. You can't manage what you don't know, what you cannot measure. So let's invest in the knowledge, again, because these resources are shared. Again, considering that we have a number of transboundary aquifers, but we don't have any transboundary aquifer organization in the IGAD region, points to the fact that we are really sitting on a time bomb, but a time bomb that really may affect our socio-economic development. Let's invest in studying, assessing these transboundary aquifers so that we can know how much water we have and how much we are depending on them, on the water, and how we can protect this resource, and then be able to put in place institutional frameworks. The governance mechanisms are needed, and I think within this region it is clear. And I'm happy to note that within, for example, the Nile Basin Initiative and IGAD region, we have started investing on this, understanding the resource, putting in place governance mechanisms. We need to do a bit more to ensure that we take advantage of this resource for peace and stability. Thank you very much, Chair.
Let me invite those who are online to make up your, include your chats on the chat box. Please, if you have comments, questions, suggestions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat box. I would like to invite Mr. Brighton Munyai from the SADC region, representing James Sureyama. Mr. Brighton, please.
To the key for highlighting some very important. Can you hear me?
Yes, Mr. Brighton, we can hear you. But
thank you.
We can hear you.
So I was just commenting that thank you to Jenny for a very insightful keynote that highlighted most of the issues that are prevalent within our region as well. We note that on the African continent, there are more than 63 transboundary river basins that are shared by at least one country. We also note that within our region, within our continent, the river basins exist in areas where the rainfall patterns are very variable. And this has been aggravated by the impacts of climate change. And the population is also increasing, as you would imagine. So the increase in population is also putting pressure on surface water resources. And this is a generally known statistic that freshwater resources, renewable freshwater resources, are more than 95% coming from groundwater. On the African continent as well, we have over 72 TBAs or transboundary aquifers. Of these, we have about 30 in our region in SADC. It is estimated that 75% of the population on the African continent depends or relies on groundwater. And this was highlighted by Dr. Kalist as well. And in our SADC region, this is about 70% of the communities relying on groundwater. And in most cases, this is in the rural areas where sometimes the only resource that is available to support their livelihoods is groundwater. So we have a scenario here where if groundwater is not available to close the gaps that surface water is gradually failing to cope with because of the impacts of climate change and other human settlement activities such as pollution and so forth and so forth, the use of groundwater needs to be carefully managed. So the effective management of groundwater is critical for peace building and stability. And some of the key reasons for this is the increasing demand and the unavailability of surface water, which is receding from the pressures that I just mentioned. Groundwater, of course, is more resilient to the impacts of climate change, and therefore we need to be more careful and more dedicated in managing groundwater than we have ever done in the past. We also are aware that groundwater-dependent ecosystems cut across our boundaries, our national borders, and if they are managed up to the border and not across borders, then we risk the conflicts that arise out of there. I think we know some people are talking about grazing for livestock and general water supplies for human use. So without transboundary or cross-border management of groundwater and the groundwater-dependent ecosystems, we risk the conflicts that we would like to avoid. The impacts of climate change, which includes flooding and droughts and so forth, occur across boundaries. So we should not look at groundwater as a resource that exists only nationally. It is therefore critical to operationalize governance mechanisms that recognize the mutual interests of the resource for the benefits that it gives to the respective countries that share the resource. So like surface water, transboundary aquifers require effective protocols and agreements for data collection and management across the riparian countries that share this resource. So there's, in our region, in the SADC, we are fortunate to have what we call the Protocol on Shared Water Courses, which has got a very good framework for the management of both surface and groundwater resources. However, we still have challenges in operationalizing or ensuring that the provisions of these instruments are effectively managed. We have got what we call regional strategic action plans, which are instruments that help us to implement initiatives on a 5-year rolling term to address the impacts of climate change and accommodate groundwater. So with these systems, we have an enabling policy, legal, and institutional framework for regional and national groundwater management. Within our region as well, we are cognizant of the challenges that come about because of conflicts for groundwater. So we have got in the 30 transboundary aquifers, we undertake some activities which include joint transboundary diagnostic analysis, where the stakeholders from grassroots all the way up to national and regional discuss and identify the characteristics of these transboundary aquifers from a lithological to socioeconomic perspective. So this is a rallying point or an instrument that helps people to collaborate. From there, they also develop the joint strategic action plans. So these are strategic documents that helps the member states and communities to prioritize initiatives that support the development of these. So in our region, out of the 30 transboundary aquifers, we've done 5 transboundary diagnostic analysis and some joint strategic action plans. So we are trying to say, in order to manage peace and stability through groundwater, we are doing this, we are implementing these initiatives. Within the joint strategic action plans, there are also aspects that Jenny has referred to, that is the implementation or installation of monitoring networks, where everyone within the system contributes to the collection of data and its management and sharing protocols for the data. Obviously, we cannot manage what we don't know. And if we don't generate information from this data, and if we don't share the data, then we will not, at the end of the day, be able to manage this resource. So this is a critical aspect to manage peace and stability. We are also working on investments, joint investments, where we look for funding of different forms to support joint projects developed within these systems. And I think some of them relate to agricultural development, others relate to domestic water supply, and so forth and so forth. Finally, we also work on institution building. So we have the river basin organizations where transboundary groundwater exists in river basin organizations. We also facilitate the establishment of groundwater committees within the river basin organizations, as well as the multi-country cooperation mechanism model that was piloted within our region by UNESCO IHP. These are instruments that try to support groundwater as an instrument for building peace within our region. And I believe this is a model that can assist. Thank you so much, facilitator, and thank you, Jenny, for an insightful keynote. Thank you.
Mr. Brighton, that was excellent. I still have Karen Villanov online, but let me start with the participant here. So I give you the floor now. Maximum 5 minutes. Could you just introduce yourself so that we have a good record?
Yeah. We have, in a region where the IGAD region has a lot of resource water, but we cannot utilize it and manage. So we have two problems. When the rain delay or the drought is coming, and when the coming the raining time, a lot of fluids comes and a lot of people displayed and all the properties destroyed. So how can we manage this resource? It is sometimes effective two ways. When there is no the water or the delay in the rain or comes the drafts, is the problem is standoff. When the water and rain time, it increases the problems of the evacuation of the people and destruction. So this is the serious problem. I wanted to solve it. Then we can, how can we utilize this resources? The question is that. On the other hand, I think if we have the sharing an idea of the knowledge of the region, of the water systematic catch, I think the increase of the production of the local, the life will be changed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. I think we have a very clear picture of the problem, the issues, and I think we need to move to solutions. Let me invite Karen Velenov to, as well, she was one of our panelists, and she's now online. Karen is basically a groundwater solution expert and also a policy analyst. Karen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you also to Jenny for the presentation. I must admit I didn't have a chance to listen to your presentation because I was giving a keynote in another session, so this was a bit unfortunate, but I will give a few pointers and also building on what the panelists brought forward. Can you hear me well? Okay. Yes, we can hear you. Good. There's a lot of echo at the moment. Anyway, groundwater I think is a very key resource for IGAD in terms of resilience and water security going forward. And we have to find those solutions that are supporting in alleviating, hardship and so on for the poorest in the region. You can say that many of these communities, especially in the arid and very semi-arid areas, have been living under these conditions for centuries, for generations. So it's very much a culture that you're talking about. But we have to realize with climate change, the culture is under pressure, if you like. And so the livelihood strategies and the way of life that these people have been used to are sort of changing. And it puts these people under a lot of pressure, as you can imagine. And that's why we see these conflicts. And of course, conflicts are not only driven by climate change. I think that's another factor to think about. And so there are many compounding factors that create fragility and instability and so on. But we need to understand where these different factors come in, and also the role of water. And I think this is the key part of what we're discussing here. And of course, as we know, groundwater can have a very clear role in supporting more stability if that resource is available sustainably and to the people where they need it and when they need it. And so I think that's where we have to look at groundwater as a resilience building resource, and where it's critically important that we develop it in a climate smart way. So we need to look at these resources to be protected from flooding and from droughts. And oftentimes that's maybe not considered when we implement infrastructure for groundwater. So sometimes the wells go dry. We have to think of better infrastructure that's deeper, that's protected from flooding, that can also create more pollution. And the flooding can basically submerge the wells and so on. So thinking smartly about how to go about development of groundwater for communities that are particularly vulnerable. I think that's a key point. As we go along with developing the resource, not only for supply, because people also need livelihoods, so we also need to think of the multiple use of the resource for small-scale livelihoods like small-scale agriculture, besides the pastoralism that's already very widespread. But there could also be other opportunities that farmers can develop. And with increasing access to solar energy and so on, there might also be opportunities here. And IMI is working in that space, something to further also like combine with the development of the resource. And in conjunction with that, also think of the replenishment of the resource. As we know, and as we see already in parts of IGAD, there's overexploitation of the resource. And so thinking how we can support the harvesting of rainwater, the flood waters, and even if it's possible to reuse wastewater in a safe way. So we need to look at all the sources that are there and use groundwater in a smart way to enhance the storage so that it's available throughout the droughts, even the worst droughts. So I think that's something we need to think of. We also have to think of what we do in areas that have maybe not been served by groundwater before, because it can actually create new dynamism between the communities and so on. And so I think Caliste highlighted that it creates peace because now everybody has access to water. But it can also actually create tension if the resource that it's being put in place is not equitably shared between those communities that are now having access to it or not having access to it. And it's also very much linked to the land around the resources. So if there's a well installed somewhere that gives good quality water and so on, who has access to the land and can maybe use that for irrigation and creating those opportunities. So it's very much linked to the governance systems, who is actually getting access to those new resources, and how does this enhance stability and not create new conflicts, if you like, over these new resources. We've also worked at IMI with artificial water points for livestock. And it could also be relevant in the IGAD region because you have many conservation areas and so on that are also being threatened by climate change, which influences livestock and their migration patterns and so on. And here we can also think of how groundwater can come in and support on the livestock and on the tourism sector and so on. Something that we're looking at the moment. And also in that regard, similar to what I mentioned before, make sure that it doesn't create the opposite intentions of what you are looking at. Because with livestock, you can actually create dependence on these systems that then mean that they don't move around and they stay sedentary around the wells rather than migrate according to their natural patterns. And this can create new dynamism between predators and herbivores. And so just again, being very mindful when we implement groundwater and try to enhance resilience in these very vulnerable regions and do it in a mindful and very well thought through way. I think that's my contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jenny. That's a very excellent contribution. Ladies and gentlemen, I know I'm running out of time. I've run out of time. and I would like to give the audience here, if there are two of you who has one important issue to raise, please raise up your hand, and then I'll give you a half a minute to raise that issue. If it requires a response, I'll go back to seek for response. Then I'll give the panelists here, ask them the question that we have now seen the problem. Where are we going from here? So each one of you, I'll give 2 minutes just to think through that, and then in a few words, just say, I think the best direction is bang, 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 and you just stop. Don't give further explanation. I think we want to problematize the issue so that we know how to solve it going forward. So I'll give you, Caliste, 2 minutes, and Emmanuel 2 minutes. But there is a question also from the participants, which I'll ask Jenny also to respond to, 1 minute only. This is from Dan Kibet. And Dan Kibet is asking Jenny, what is your take on the impact of the construction of the dam by Ethiopia on around the water, on the groundwater, vis-a-vis conflict in the Nile Basin? If Jenny is around, I'll give you also 2 minutes to respond to this. But let me start with the audience. Two of you. You just need to raise up your hand, and I'll give you 2 minutes to ask the question, make a comment. I see none coming. Jenny, are you still in? Is Jenny still in the room? Where's her hand? Please. Not more than 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the panelists as well as the presenters for very important views that they have brought to this session. Saying this, I have 2 questions. One is there are different modalities of cooperation within a region. One is basin-wise approach of cooperation. There is basin-wise approach and regional-wise approach. Which one is effective from your experience? This question goes for, I think, Jenny. I think so. Yeah. The second question is, most of time in water discourses, the focus is on exploitation of existing resources, but without strategic thinking and investment in ecosystem. Taking into account the current pressure in the region, population growth, drought, climate, and so forth, and competition for resources. I think it's going to be very problematic in the future. So, what is your take on that regard? What is your view regarding cooperation on system-wise investment, joint investment on ecosystem? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think I've taken the 2 questions. I would like to stop there, ladies and gentlemen, otherwise I will be stuck. I'm sorry. Jenny, are you still in the house to respond to those 2 questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Jenny, you have 2 minutes for each question, and you have 2 questions. Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm really, really sorry. I could not hear well what the question from the audience was, but the one and there's a terrible echo. The question from Mr. Dan Kibet with regards to the GERD dam. I would like to actually pause on that question because we are discussing groundwater today, and the GERD can be discussed in terms of groundwater, but I'm not an expert on this, so with all due respect, I will pass on that one. And I'm really sorry that I did not fully hear the question that came from the audience. So if that can be repeated, please.
Sorry, Jenny, the second question was how do we approach the management of groundwater in the region? A basin approach, a ecosystems approach, which one works?
All of them together. So I think one term that I did not mention in my keynote was diversification. We need groundwater. We need groundwater conjunctively with surface water. We need deep aquifers. We need reuse of wastewater. We need water from all the different sources that we can get. So management is about all those different sources, all those different resources, and all the different actors that are involved using them, producing them, affecting them, and so on. So we cannot point to any one system, any one solution being better, more needed than the others. It's simply a matter of we're in a situation where we cannot choose. We need to go for everything at the same time, basically. It's not the most clear answer, but I think it's
Very much, Jenny. Let me give Emmanuel 2 minutes. After listening to this discussion, where do we go from here? Emmanuel. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, moderator, for giving me this chance once again. I'm really grateful, especially to hear from Janet that countries do not go to war, or at least they have not gone to war. Or if they have gone to war, it has not been documented and reported. Although there may be some proxy wars taking place within the IGAD region, we still don't have any background about that. But we do acknowledge that conflicts within communities, especially in my country, in South Sudan, do happen. And we have been working very hard to ensure that communities are provided with water, especially during dry season. Unfortunately, the communities are not empowered in order to be able to maintain the water facilities, especially the open, have fields. Therefore, my recommendation as a way forward is that we all acknowledge groundwater is a finite resource, and therefore efforts must be made to limit its use as much as possible wherever we can, but to ensure that we strategically enrich the groundwater for generations to come. While doing that, in the process of doing the artificial groundwater recharge, we need to constantly monitor the quality and the quantity of the water using appropriate technologies like piezometric groundwater observation stations, which are channeled to dashboards within countries, and this information is shared within the IGAD region. One other aspect is about we have not talked about tariff. A groundwater, the tariff in a certain transboundary aquifer may be different from the other. But as the keynote speakers have spoken, if we can have wider consultation and ensure that, because at the end of the day, these are the same communities, but they're living in different parts of the border. If the tariff is unified within the region, that will give uniform incentives to communities and users of the same transboundary water facility. We would like also to encourage governments to have common laws and regulations to regulate the use and utilization of these water resources. In terms of cooperation, whenever it's feasible and possible, where surplus surface water exists in one region, and there's a possibility of channeling that water to enrich a member country within the IGAD region with the surface or groundwater, I think that's something we would like to look forward in order to minimize conflicts within the region. Thank you very much.
And our chat is full with questions. I would like to encourage them to go on, but we cannot respond to all of them. Let me give 2 minutes to Dr. Calist, please. 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think what is clear is that we cannot address groundwater issues as individual countries. We need to work together in the IGAD region because we have a road that brings us together. These resources are shared, they cut across borders. So a number of things I feel we should give focus to. Number one, we need to put in place a regional program for groundwater assessment, monitoring, regulation, data management, and capacity building. We help each other to put the best practices in place. Some countries are moving, but others probably haven't yet started. But handling it at regional level will help us to move. The second one is to establish some structure to help us manage these resources at the IGAD secretariat level, at the South Basin level, at the country level. We cannot afford to leave groundwater to remain there without any governing structure, and maybe assess possibilities of integrating groundwater and river basin management. We are having already, it was mentioned that 86% of the Nile Basin actually is within IGAD region. How much can we have this groundwater managed as part of the Nile Basin initiative? Then the other issue I think we need to put in place is, we say groundwater is important, but how important is it? I think the economic contribution of groundwater to our socio-economic development needs to be given attention. At least some numbers. And finally, a program where we can effectively manage and develop these resources for the benefit of our countries. Again, if we leave it to individual countries, they will struggle. But if we work as a region, we'll help each other, take advantage of regional resources, take advantage of regional capacities, we'll be able to do more than we would be able to do as individual countries. Thank you very much, Chair.
This session to a close. I'd like to thank the chair of this session, Dr. Tumor from Kenya, who started us off. I thank the keynote speaker and the panelists. This session was quite rich in terms of panelists, and therefore it went much longer than anticipated. I want to also thank the audience and those who are online. I would suggest that even those who are here can still go back to the online and keep the chart, because this is an area in which I will suggest later that we pursue more vigorously. I suggest that we break for 10 minutes coffee break. We are really behind. All the sessions have moved. They have had their coffee and tea, and they have resumed the latter part of the session. So please, if you want to move from this session to the next one, then you need to grab a cup of coffee and move. If you are coming back here, 10 minutes, and then we start. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, panelists. Oh.
Yeah, I think I'm doing well.